Madeleine walked over to the easel and contemplated the half-finished drawing long and attentively. Dr. Bickleigh's sick anxiety as he waited for her condemnation was almost unbearable. He had long ago forgotten all about their respective ages. It was no longer a man of 37 waiting for the criticism of a young girl of 22 whose powers of judging half-finished charcoal drawings might, to put it at its least, be immature. It was the Creator, offering the work of his hands to the one person in the world for whom it had been shaped. "It's clever," at last said Madeleine quietly. The confidence of her tone might have made one suppose that the one thing of which she had made a life study was the judging of half-finished charcoal drawings. Dr. Bickleigh discovered that he had been actually holding his breath, and expelled it in a surge of relief. "Do you really think so? I say, it's wonderful to hear you say that." "Very clever," Madeleine continued slowly, still examining the picture, her head a little on one side, her broad white forehead just furrowed, her expressive eyes narrowed. "But then I think your work is clever." She spoke without any of that easy enthusiasm which the conscientious craftsman dreads more than the most damning criticism. Her words carried the impression of a balanced judgment, carefully formed and as carefully weighed after formation. There was not a suspicion of flattery in her flattery. Dr. Bickleigh could only beam in silence. "But I don't see what you mean by not being able to get me. I think it's exactly me." In his eagerness, Dr. Bickleigh came and stood close behind her, studying his work over her shoulder. "Oh, yes, it's like you, but that isn't the point. Anyone with a bit of a knack could draw something that would be like you. I was trying to get at you. I mean, show where you differ from everyone else. Why, you're you and could never be anyone who isn't you. No, that's idiotic, it's difficult to explain, but, well, I mean, your expression, that particular look you have, your wonderful—" "I think I understand," Madeleine said gently, and walked over to the window. "And I think you have got at me," she added in a low voice, looking out over the rain-drenched lawn, now glistening in a burst of sunshine. Dr. Bickleigh followed her. His heart was thumping and his mouth had gone dry. "Not the real you," he said. "That's just the one the world sees, the outside, everyday you. I was trying to show the inside one, the one you hide from everyone, except for a tiny glimpse now and then, to some lucky person." "I'm beginning to make love to her," he thought desperately. I mustn't, it'll spoil everything. She'd hate it, she'd never speak to me again. Besides, what coarseness, with her." But something drove him on. Madeleine was still gazing out of the window. "And you imagine there is such a me?" "I don't imagine," said Dr. Bickleigh hoarsely. "I know." "I mustn't," his brain repeated mechanically, to the rhythm of his pounding heart. "I mustn't make love to her, I mustn't. And I think I've been privileged to catch one or two of those glimpses." His knees seemed to have lost all their strength. Madeleine did not turn her head. "Perhaps you have," she said almost inaudibly. There was a full minute's silence. Dr. Bickleigh's mind whirled hither and thither. She could not mean. She did not understand what she was implying. He must not. Suddenly, a desperate calmness fell on him. He rushed on his fate. "I suppose you know what I'm doing?" Madeleine turned and looked him full in the eyes. "Yes, I know." "I'm making love to you." "Yes." The next instant, she was in his arms. "Madeleine! Oh, Edmund!" Dr. Bickleigh's first impulse had been to tell Julia that he and Madeleine loved one another. In such an affair as this, subterfuge and concealment seemed out of place. To hide it from his wife would be to bring it down to the level of those other ignoble little liaisons which he now so bitterly regretted. On the highest peak of exaltation himself, Dr. Bickleigh meant all the circumstances of his incredible new happiness to remain there too. Rather to his surprise, it was Madeleine who was against this course. It was foolish, she pointed out, to act precipitately. They must be quite sure of themselves before they took any steps which might prove irrevocable. In the meantime, it would be unkind to Julia to cause her more suffering than was necessary. "We mustn't think of ourselves, dear," she said very earnestly. "We have each other after all, but your poor wife. I know exactly what you feel, and I feel it too. You understand me well enough, surely, to realize that I detest anything underhand as much as you do, but we mustn't consider our own feelings. We must think of hers." And Dr. Bickleigh agreed that they must sacrifice themselves for Julia's peace of mind. They talked about her a good deal, calling her poor Julia, and were very sorry for her indeed. Nevertheless, driving home just in time for evening surgery, he regretted the decision. It would have been a wonderful expression of the sober exhilaration that possessed him to walk straight in to Julia and tell her everything. A magnificent gesture. He saw himself breaking the news to her with quiet dignity. No recriminations, no cheap triumph at her expense. But after that, the vision faded out. He simply could not see Julia's reactions to his news. She had such a width of choice. One thing, however, Dr. Bickleigh did determine. He would be as honest with her as he possibly could. Except so far as was necessary to preserve the one vital secret, no lie should pass his lips at all. He actually hoped Julia would give him the opportunity to be honest. Julia did. As he was hanging up his hat in the dark little lobby at the back of the hall, she came out of the drawing-room and looked in her short-sighted way in his direction. "Is that you, Edmund? You were not in to tea?" It never worried Mrs. Bickleigh to state self-evident facts. "Where were you?" "I was at the hall," replied Dr. Bickleigh. He looked her full in the face for a few moments, to give her every opportunity of a reply if she wished to make one, and then walked down the passage and into his consulting-room. Julia turned back into the drawing-room without a word. Dr. Bickleigh's mood of unworldly exaltation lasted right through surgery and until the gong rang for dinner. Then it began to ebb a little. But there was enough of it left to enable him to confront Julia, if not with the quiet dignity he had pictured, at any rate with defiance. He recognized the defiance, and it irked him. He had been feeling for the last few hours so very, very far above Julia and all she stood for. It was annoying to find now that he had to face her much as a defiant mouse would face a cat. However superior to any number of cats a mouse may feel in its own hole, it requires a good deal of self-suggestion to maintain this opinion in the presence of the cat. Dr. Bickleigh had to keep on reminding himself of the miracle that Madeleine loved him, and that Julia therefore mattered rather less than nothing to anybody. Julia, however, did not call his defiance into play. She made no reference to his visit to the hall. It was as if the scene before surgery had not happened at all. She was not even silent, speaking to him no less and no more than usual. In every respect she behaved in her perfectly normal manner. This made Dr. Bickleigh uneasy. It was unlike Julia, he felt, and therefore ominous. Never having defied her commands before, however, he did not know in the least what would be like her on such an occasion. It did not occur to him that, having encountered an unprecedented situation, Julia herself might be at a loss, and uncertain how to deal with it. It never would have occurred to Dr. Bickleigh that his wife was even capable of being at a loss. The same game of polite make-believe followed them into the drawing-room after dinner. Dr. Bickleigh played it tensely, with growing disquiet, nervously fingering the waxed ends of his little moustache. Julia, apparently, was not playing it at all. A country doctor does not have so many evening calls as his townsmen colleagues. Can it be that people are more considerate in the country than in towns? And Dr. Bickleigh was accustomed to spend his evenings in the drawing-room with his wife. He over a book from the library in Merchester, and she with a piece of embroidery or crochet work. Julia did not care for reading. Julia did not care for the wireless either, so they had no set. Dr. Bickleigh had often tried to persuade her just to give it a trial, but she was quite sure she would not like it. Now, as she spoke from time to time of this and that, and he looked up from his book to answer her, not being a reader herself, Julia always seemed to make a point of letting anyone else do so for no more than 5 minutes without interruption. Dr. Bickleigh was wishing that a call would reach him and take him out of this anxious room, out of the house. Something serious, a road accident, a murder case even, that would keep him out for some time. But, of course, no call came. Only once did Julia make any remark that might be construed as having the slightest reference to the all-important subject. "Edmund," she said abruptly, "I have a very severe headache. Please get me something from the surgery to relieve it." "Yes, of course." Dr. Bickleigh bounded to his feet, glad of any action, however insignificant. "Aspirin?" "You know very well that aspirin doesn't suit me." "Oh, yes. Yes, I remember. I'll get you something else." He went to the surgery and stood there, delaying. A definite dread of going back to the drawing-room possessed him. It was inconceivable that Julia was going to pass over the whole thing like this. No, she was saving it up, playing her damned game of cat and mouse, knowing perfectly well what he was feeling. And if she had one of her headaches this evening too, Dr. Bickleigh knew those headaches. He usually treated them with the preparation of phenacetin. The suggestion of aspirin had been a nervous lapse of memory, but tonight a sudden thought struck him, and he laughed out loud. Taking down a jar of tablets, he shook 2 out into his palm, dropped them into a measure, added water, and began to dissolve them. There were advantages in being a doctor. A nice little dose of morphia should make Julia far too sleepy to be able to do justice to her subject tonight. He pounded the tablets with a glass rod. When they were quite dissolved, he paused for a moment. Should he? No. Julia's powers of resistance were above the normal. Better make sure while he was at it. He took down the jar again, shook out 2 more tablets, and dropped them into the measure too. Not even Julia would be able to resist a full half-grain. Dr. Bickleigh was right. Within 20 minutes, Julia found herself so sleepy that she was compelled to go upstairs to bed. With a smile, Dr. Bickleigh pushed aside his book and gave himself up to living through, again and again, the events of the afternoon. That night, he had a new vision ready-made. Not merely life without Julia, but life with Madeleine. As a sleep-compelling medium, this vision was a failure. Julia's strange reticence lasted through breakfast the next morning. Her manner during the meal was as ominously normal as at dinner the evening before. Dr. Bickleigh felt, when he left the house for his morning round, that he was leaving a thunderstorm clamped in a small box inside it. He wondered fearfully, and yet with a strange little thrill, how long the clamps would hold. He dreaded the inevitable battle, and at the same time almost welcomed it. He went through his morning's work in a dreamy daze, living only for the afternoon. So completely had all thought of Ivy disappeared that he did not at first even recognize her when he caught sight of a female figure signalling to him at the side of the road, and pulled up automatically. "Teddy," she said mournfully as he came to a stop abreast of her. "Why, hello, Ivy." No little stab of apprehension, no exasperation. Seldom can a man have felt more at his ease in the presence of a recently discarded mistress. Dr. Bickleigh was surprised to notice how completely master of the situation he felt. It was a new sensation to him, and a delightful one. Ivy nervously tucked a stray curl under her small blue hat. "I knew Mrs. Belstone's ill, and I thought you'd be coming this way. I've been waiting nearly an hour." "Yes? Teddy, I must speak to you." "I'm very busy, Ivy." "You're always busy now when I want to see you." Her lower lip began to tremble. Dr. Bickleigh watched it with detached interest. How curious that a lip should wobble rapidly to indicate emotion. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't even pathetic. Had he really once thought it was? It was just ludicrous. "I really am busy," he said patiently, "but that doesn't say I can't spare 5 minutes. Jump in, I'll take you on a bit with me." "We oughtn't to be seen together," she hesitated. "Jump in." He opened the door for her. Ivy got in, with a glance up and down the road. He let in the clutch, and the car moved forward. "Well," he smiled, "what is it, Ivy?" He felt as if she were a small child. It was a shame to have to hurt her, but it had got to be done. He would be as merciful as he could. "Oh, Teddy." He pretended to be absorbed in driving along the narrow road to give her time to collect herself. It was quite plain what she wanted to say. He no longer loved her, did he? And this time he was not going to deny it. A clean break had got to be made, a clean, honest break. Any other course now was unthinkable. Well, may as well get it over, but not in public. They were passing through a small wood now, and Dr. Bickleigh turned the car along a track that led into it. He drove till they were out of sight of the road and then came to a halt. "Now then, Ivy." "Teddy." "Yes." "Oh, I don't know how to tell you. I don't." Her hands, in brown suede gauntlets, were twisting in her lap. She had very small hands, and the wide gauntlets at her wrists made them look smaller still. He had adored her tiny hands and feet, and could notice still how pretty they were. "Tell me, what?" "Something terrible." She looked at him with eyes that were really terrified. Some of her fear communicated itself to him. "What do you mean?" he asked sharply. I'm going to have a baby." "Nonsense." He twisted in his seat and stared at her. She shrank a little away from him. "I am, Teddy. I am. I ought to know, oughtn't I?" "Then it isn't mine," he said brutally. Her eyes swam. She buried her face in her hands, weeping. "Oh, Teddy," she moaned. "Ivy, who else have you been with?" She shook her head mutely and repeated the question. "Oh, Teddy, how can you? How can you?" "You must have been." "I haven't," she choked. "I swear I haven't. I swear it." "Well, it isn't mine, that's certain." But he believed her. A cold dismay invaded his body. He began to sweat. This was terrible. Oh, damn the girl, damn her! What was to happen now? Little fool. She would somehow manage to... Presumably, he must believe her when she said she hadn't... Oh, hell! And Madeleine... He got out of the car and walked up and down the track, pushing the ends of his moustache into his mouth and biting them savagely, hardly conscious of what he was doing. "Teddy, I'm sorry." "Oh, it's all right. I suppose it isn't your fault." But his tone implied that it was. Ivy began to cry. As always, her tears, which a few minutes ago he had been ready to tolerate, irritated him almost beyond control. This was a serious business. They had got to thresh it out. It is impossible to get much further if one of the parties to a discussion keeps her face buried in her hands and sobs into them. "Ivy, for heaven's sake, stop that damned crying! How on earth can we talk if you won't keep calm?" She made an obvious effort to pull herself together, wiped her eyes, and blew her reddened nose. Crying completely spoilt her looks, but she had never learnt not to give way to it. By degrees, her sobs died down. "I don't believe it. It's pure imagination." Ivy stared sullenly through the windscreen ahead. "Yes, it's easy to say that, isn't it?" He hardly recognized her voice. This was a new Ivy all of a sudden, an Ivy he had never met before. From being helpless and clinging, she'd become in a flash like a stubborn bit of tough rubber. "Well, how do you know?" "The usual way, of course." He glanced at her sideways. "If you really are..." Suddenly, he reached a decision. "All right, Ivy. You needn't worry. It's quite simple. I'll operate." She started. But doctors aren't allowed to." "Really, my dear girl," he laughed harshly. "Sometimes doctors have no choice." "You might kill me. It's dangerous." "Not in properly qualified hands. Don't be such a little fool." He was beginning to lose his temper. "There's no danger at all with me. Do you think I'd suggest it if there was? Do use your sense." "You don't care what happens to me." He shrugged his shoulders and controlled his rising anger. After all, there might be no immediate hurry, though that he must discover, and she would have to consent, but if she was going to be difficult, oh God, what a mess this was! He recalled that inspiration he had had on the ledge at the entrance to the cave. It no longer seemed so horrible. Horrible? It was beautifully simple, and there could be no question afterward. It would be plain that she had been scrambling up the side and missed her footing. And what a solution it would have been! He almost regretted not having had the nerve to do it. The nerve! That's all that is needed. He looked with something like hatred at her tear-stained face, as she sat there staring stubbornly ahead, and a cold fury seized hold of him. Well, by God, it wasn't too late yet. If the little idiot was going to be difficult, if there was going to be any question of her coming between him and Madeleine, or even of Madeleine ever hearing, well, she had better look out. He swung off at a sharp angle into the undergrowth. "Teddy!" She had scrambled out of the car and followed him. Her sullenness had gone. There was the old pathetic note in her voice. "Teddy, aren't you a little bit sorry for me?" Yes, he said impatiently. "You're not. You're cross." It was all he could do to answer her civilly. Well, who wouldn't be? "If you really loved me, you'd be glad." "Glad? You're going to have an illegitimate child?" he said angrily. "Oh, don't be such a fool." "You don't love me," she sobbed. "You don't. Now I really know. You wouldn't be so unkind. Oh, Teddy." "Well, it's lucky I'm not going to have a baby after all." "What?" he shouted. "What was that?" His tone frightened her tears away, but she faced him with a certain defiance. "No, I'm not. I made it all up, to find out if you really do love me or not, because you never would tell me. You're not brave enough, I suppose. Well, now I do know." She laughed hysterically. "Ha! So, it's lucky I'm not like that, isn't it?" He stared at her, his face white, loathing her. "You little bitch!" "Yes, that's right," she cried shrilly. "Call me beastly vulgar names. I'm nothing now, of course. Not since you met your precious Madeleine. Why don't you call her that? That's what she is, and everyone knows it but you. She's just a—" Something took control of Dr. Bickleigh. Something that made him hit Ivy in the face with his clenched fist, knocking her backwards into a tangle of brambles and smashing back the blasphemy onto her lips. Something that took him striding, with set, mask-like face and burning eyes, back to the car, heedless of the wailing cries that followed him. "Teddy! Oh, Teddy, I didn't mean... Teddy, darling!" He jammed in the gear as if he hardly knew what he was doing and threw in the clutch. The car leapt forward. He drove at top speed out of the wood and down the road. Dr. Bickleigh had never laid any but amorous hands on a woman before. His brain, incapable of thought, was throbbing with mixed emotion. Half of it was disgust, and half a queer, shouting exaltation. By lunchtime he had stopped trembling, but he had not forgiven Ivy. On his own account, yes. Considered from that point of view, Ivy was merely pitiable. He was really sorry for her. But the feeling that stayed with him was that Ivy had insulted not himself but Madeleine, not merely her futile outburst against Madeleine in person, but his own new standing with Madeleine, his attempt to make himself more worthy of Madeleine, all that Madeleine stood for. It all came back to Madeleine, and that was unforgivable. Nevertheless, he was glad now, in his sane senses, that there could be no question of that ledge outside the cave, and could shudder to wonder what might not have happened if such a question had arisen. The intensity of his rage with Ivy had frightened himself afterwards. In that mood, heaven alone knew what he might not have done. But it was rather wonderful, he could not help feeling, that the capability for such a mood existed in him at all. He was rather silent at lunch, answering Julia with such abruptness that she raised her thick eyebrows at him. Afterwards, when he was putting on his hat in front of the hall mirror to start out again, she said, "Are you going to be in to tea today, Edmund?" "No," he answered, without turning round. Then something impelled him to add, "I shall be having tea at the hall." He wished Julia would burst out at that. A real hammer-and-tongs row at that moment, such as he and Julia had never had in their lives, would do him all the good in the world, while he was still so on edge from the morning. Relieve his tautened nerves, afford him something on which to expend his bottled-up energy. Besides, he felt just then ready to give Julia as good as she could give him, and better. But Julia did not oblige. She merely said, "You will be in to dinner?" "Of course. Why not?" "Very well. I shall want to talk to you after it." That was just like Julia, he thought, savagely cranking up the car. The Jowett self-starter seldom worked nowadays. She had probably worked out to the minute how many hours of uneasy anticipation he should have. More than ever he longed for Madeleine. There were several more visits to pay before he could consider himself free enough to go up to the hall. He hurried through them, cursing Ivy for having cut so into his morning. It was nearly 4 o'clock before he drew up before the iron-studded oak front door. Madeleine was in the hall, obviously waiting for him. They kissed in silence before greeting each other. She was wearing a hat and seemed to be dressed to go out. "Oh, dear, I'm so sorry, but I can't stay," she said. "I ought not to have waited so long, but I had to see you first, and I knew you'd come. I'm due for tea at the Bournes." He looked his terrible disappointment. "You never told me yesterday." "I didn't know. Lady Bourne sent her son over with a note this morning." "Denny, you should have told him you couldn't go." "But it would have looked so bad." "Not if you'd got a previous engagement." Madeleine shook her head. "No, I felt I ought to go. It's a nuisance, Edmund, but we mustn't always think of ourselves, must we? And anyhow, you've seen me first." "You're the dearest girl," muttered Dr. Bickleigh, and kissed her again. She was exactly the same height as himself. "And Edmund," she said gently, disengaging herself after a moment, "I don't think you must come up here every day." "But I must see you whenever I possibly can." "Yes, but not every day, not nearly every day. People would begin to talk at once." "Good heavens, let 'em," declared the infatuated doctor. "Don't tell me you're afraid of a bit of cheap gossip, Madeleine." "I was thinking of you, dear," she told him reproachfully. "Gossip does a doctor so much harm." "Well, when can I see you?" In the end, it was arranged that Madeleine should be walking in her woods every Monday and Friday near the lake. On Wednesdays, the day when he had no evening surgery, Dr. Bickleigh should come to the house itself with his sketching materials as a disguise and stay for tea. Saturdays and Sundays were no good because of tennis parties. Tuesdays and Thursdays must be sacrificed. Dr. Bickleigh grumbled a good deal, but Madeleine was not to be moved. "And anyhow," she pointed out, "it will be Friday the day after tomorrow." "But it's Wednesday today." "My day for tea." "You had your Wednesday tea yesterday," she smiled. "You mustn't be greedy, Edmund." He had never heard her so playful before. It delighted him so much that he let her carry the point. "And now I must go." They had an impassioned parting. Dr. Bickleigh drove away gloomily, wishing that Madeleine had not been so firm, wishing that she would let him choose her hats for her. He felt terribly flat. To return home was impossible. In the end, he drove into Merchester and had tea at a cafe there, spinning it out as long as possible. The rest of the interval before dinner he spent with a book he had bought for the purpose in Merchester, and disliked as soon as he began to read it, lying in a field 6 miles from home. The ground was damp after yesterday's rain, and he had no rug with him. By the time he did get home, his reaction from the nervous energy of lunchtime was complete. He felt utterly worn out, tired, disappointed and dispirited. So far from standing up to Julia after dinner, he could hardly endure the thought of friction. Definitely, he decided, he could not bear it. And yet it was hardly possible to go out again, while to flee to bed under pretence of being unwell would be worse than useless, for Julia would only follow him up there, and he would be more at her mercy than ever. If only she had had one of her headaches today, so that he could get rid of her with the same ease as last night. He wandered into his surgery and looked gratefully at the bottle of morphia tablets. Julia. Oh, Lord! She would wipe the floor with him tonight. Simply wipe the floor with him. He couldn't stand up to her. Couldn't do it. She would try to make him renounce going to the hall. Renounce Madeleine. Renounce the only thing in his life worth having. She would bully him into... No. Anything was better than that. Even flight. Oh, for one of her headaches. Well, but if one can cure headaches, one should be able to bring them on, too. Dr. Bickleigh struck his hands together in excitement. What a marvellous inspiration! Give her a headache, and then relieve it for her afterwards with morphia. Now, what drug would affect his purpose best? But that was where his inspiration fell down. He could not think of a single drug in his stock which would produce a headache only, accompanied by no other symptoms, not a single one. He frowned in disappointment. How absurd that there should not be such a thing. Then a vague memory stirred in him. He concentrated on it, chased it grimly, at last began to disentangle it. There had been a sample, at least 3 years ago. Some preparation put up by one of the well-known firms, one out of the hundreds he got in a year, but he had noticed it particularly because it had been so expensive, and because he had seen it noticed a day or two later in the BMJ. It had been designed for what? Ah, yes, one of the many correctives for uric acid diathesis, and it had been a failure, not only on account of its price, but because, he remembered clearly now, it induced such violent headaches. Now, had he opened the drawer where he kept such of the samples as seemed at all interesting, and searched feverishly. Tucked away at the back, he found it. Tiptoe with excitement, Dr. Bickleigh crept into the dining room. Nobody was there. In front of each place, ready on a plate, was the half of a grapefruit, ready prepared, with a crystallized cherry in the middle. Hurriedly, Dr. Bickleigh produced a folded paper from his pocket and sprinkled its contents over his wife's portion. Towards the end of the dinner that evening, Mrs. Bickleigh was attacked by such a blinding headache that she had to ask her husband for something to relieve it at once. The draught he gave her did her no good for the moment, but soon after coffee had been served in the drawing-room, she found herself so sleepy that, on the doctor's advice, she went up to bed immediately, where she fell at once into a sleep so deep that it made her oblivious even of one of the worst headaches she had ever had. Chapter 5. It would be unfair to Dr. Bickleigh's feelings to describe them during these days as an infatuation. All of us suffer at one time or another from those awkward phenomena. Dr. Bickleigh's emotion was on a higher plane altogether than the ordinary mortals. He never doubted that. The thought of Madeleine was never out of his mind. If not blazing like a beacon in the foreground, then it was glowing heartfully in the background. It illuminated his every thought and action with a bright, holy light. From a wonderful experience, Madeleine had leapt into an obsession with him. Everything else in his life, except Julia in the evenings, had faded into a pale unreality. Even Julia only existed when he was with her. He recognized this preoccupation and compared it quite sincerely with the ecstasies of certain well-known saints. But the revelation vouchsafed to him, he felt, was in one way at least greater than theirs, for though it is doubtless a miraculous thing that a divine being should put on humanity, is it not much more miraculous that a human being should put on divinity? If he had said any prayers at all, he would have said them to the spirit of Madeleine. He stood humbly aghast at the incredible thing that had happened to him. That one who was the incarnation of purity, of unworldliness, of the soul as opposed to the body, should stoop to such gross clay as himself, should reach down to lift him too onto her own exalted plane, and she had lifted him. His old life, with its sordid outlook on money and women, pettifogging details of this and that, lay in tatters about him. With outstretched finger, Madeleine pointed the way to broader, nobler ambitions and purer vistas. His old timidity began to vanish. How could he feel inferior to anyone in the world if Madeleine loved him? Madeleine, with her sweet, chaste kisses that were the physical expression only of a communion of souls. He did not desire her. He had not thought of her in that way at all. She was simply outside the orbit of gross fleshly appetites. Every kiss they exchanged, and Madeleine, as befitted one so unfleshly, was sparing with her kisses, was to him part of a breathlessly holy ritual. And he, who had become accustomed to paw every woman the moment he gained her lips, never attempted the smallest familiarity of touch with Madeleine. Her body was sacrosanct. In a word, Dr. Bickleigh had somehow managed to become 17 again. On the Thursday evening, depressed at having seen nothing of Madeleine all day, and living only for the next afternoon, he had frankly fled. A particularly difficult case had been invented right the other side of Merchester, and Dr. Bickleigh had departed the moment after swallowing his coffee. He stayed out long enough to ensure that Julia should be in bed and asleep before he returned. On Friday afternoon, bursting with eagerness, he parked his car on the side of the road and made his way into Madeleine's woods. He found her in a punt on the edge of the lake, drawn up under an overhanging tree. She looked up at him with a face more grave than usual, and did not smile in answer to his joyful greeting. "Come into the punt, Edmund." "No, not this end, dear, please. I want to talk to you very seriously." His joyful expression wiped off his face, as if with a sponge. Dr. Bickleigh sat down obediently at the other end of the punt, full of foreboding. Madeleine's enormous grey eyes regarded him mournfully. "I've been thinking since I saw you last, Edmund." "Yes?" Something cold seemed to be clamping itself round Dr. Bickleigh's heart, constricting it. "It can't go on." "You mean us?" "Yes." Dr. Bickleigh licked his dry lips. "Why not?" "It isn't fair to Julia." "But she doesn't care for me, Madeleine, any more than I do for her." "She's your wife, though. No, it wouldn't be fair." "But it wouldn't be fair to us the other way." Madeleine shook her head. "No, I've thought it all out. We mustn't go on." Dr. Bickleigh looked ahead into the darkness. He looked at Madeleine. On her face, too, was an expression of suffering. How noble she was, how altruistic always, and for Julia. "I can't give you up," he burst out passionately. "Madeleine, darling, I can't. I won't." "You must, Edmund," she returned sorrowfully. "And when I've only just found you, I can't." "Do you love me so much?" Dr. Bickleigh tried to tell her how much he loved her. The process took him to the other end of the punt beside her. She shook her head mutely, but he caught her to him, and as his arms closed round her she yielded. He held her close against him, protesting his inability to give her up ever, ever. She closed her eyes, and he kissed them gently. She let him kiss her mouth. "Oh, Madeleine," he muttered despairingly, "you can't really love me, if you can talk about giving me up." She opened her eyes and looked up at him as she lay in his arms, and said very solemnly, "Edmund, I love you more than life itself, but we must part." To add to his unhappiness, she began to cry, not with ugly, silly sobs like Ivy, but with no sign but the tears actually running down from her eyes. Dr. Bickleigh felt as if he could break the world in pieces to end such grief. He crooned and moaned over her, almost weeping himself. His ministrations, instead of soothing Madeleine, seemed to have the opposite effect. Her tears grew wilder. She clung to him. Her emotion slipped further and further out of restraint. She sobbed as desperately as ever Ivy had. Dr. Bickleigh felt as though his heart were being cut up in small pieces under his eyes, but he was still able to marvel at the depths of Madeleine's love, and call himself every vile name for having doubted it. "We can't part, my darling," he went on repeating inanely. "It would kill us both." We must, sobbed Madeleine. "I'll tell Julia everything." No, you mustn't do that. Promise you won't." "But she's not as bad as all that. She'd divorce me." "Oh, Edmund," wept Madeleine, "I couldn't marry a divorced man." It was the first time marriage had been mentioned between them, and it was not an auspicious welcome. Between tears they debated the matter. Madeleine continued to swear that she loved him more than life itself, but that she must give him up to Julia because she could never bear to think of herself as responsible for parting a husband and wife, even though they did not love one another and could never live happily together. Dr. Bickleigh, when emotion allowed him, did his best to deal with the situation. Astonished though he was at the violence of her emotion, he yet tried to reason with her. He pointed out to Madeleine, who was now clinging to him more closely with each reiteration of her decision that they must part forever, that her concern for Julia, though charming and altogether worthy of her, was quite misplaced. Julia had never shown concern for anyone else in her life. Why should she now have the benefit of their own? There was no longer any question of loyalty or disloyalty to Julia. He did not go beyond the bounds of plain truth, but that, at any rate, Madeleine must now have. He told her everything. The only result was to make Madeleine weep more unrestrainedly than before. He emphasized that there must be some good in Julia, and without doubt, when she learnt the truth, she would let him have his divorce. He repeated this several times, but Madeleine remained strangely unconvinced by it. Whatever happened, she continued to say, he must not tell Julia a single word, not a word. They must suffer, but there was no reason why Julia should too. Not one word. In the case of anyone else, Dr. Bickleigh would by this stage have diagnosed incipient hysteria. But with Madeleine, of course, that was impossible. In the end, they parted with nothing really settled, though Madeleine seemed to be taking for granted that they were parting forever. She had recovered herself more or less before Dr. Bickleigh had to go, and bade him farewell with intensity. Dr. Bickleigh returned home in a state of mental fermentation. He had refused to accept Madeleine's ultimatum. He would not even contemplate accepting it. Life without Madeleine now was unthinkable. If Madeleine took the initiative and fled from him, he would end it. He even went so far as to sketch out, during surgery between patients, an entirely new vision. Madeleine fleeing to Monte Carlo, selling the Hall, marrying precipitately some soulless brute in her own sphere. The prussic acid in the surgery, the farewell notes to Julia, to the coroner, to Madeleine. Madeleine, my own darling, life without you is impossible. Better death. Yet dying, I send you my... It was a miracle that he got through surgery without a single wrong diagnosis. He wished Madeleine had not so expressly forbidden him to say anything to Julia. It was hateful, this underhand business. Once more he felt keyed up to tell Julia everything like a decent man. She would never understand, of course, but something might come out of the interview, and Julia was still waiting to speak to him about going to the Hall. If she did, he knew he would be unable to stop himself from blurting out the truth, if only in sheer panic. Julia must be stopped from speaking. He stopped her in the same way as before. Julia complained of her head towards the end of dinner. Just after pouring out the coffee in the drawing-room afterwards, she rose unsteadily to her feet, took a few blind steps forward, and collapsed on the carpet in a dead faint. Her unconsciousness only lasted a couple of minutes, but Dr. Bickleigh had a severe fright. He had given her an overdose. Her powers of resistance were not so great as he had supposed. When she came round, she was moaning with pain, and for Julia to moan. Sweating with compunction, he ran for his syringe and injected the morphia, this time subcutaneously. It relieved her at once, and he helped her upstairs and into bed. When he came down again alone, he was shaking all over. He had no love for Julia, but it seemed unfair that she should suffer thus simply in order not to be told. He kept her in bed for the next 2 days, although she protested that she was quite recovered. That got him over 2 more evenings. On the Sunday, there was tennis at the Bournes. He went alone, taking Julia's excuses with him. He knew he would not be wanted without Julia, but he went. Madeleine was there, and they greeted each other with beautiful casualness. Madeleine took no further notice of him at all, and talked more to Denny Bourne than anybody. Dr. Bickleigh spent a miserable afternoon. On Monday, he went up to the Hall. Curiously enough, Madeleine, in spite of her expressed determination never to see him alone again, happened to be on her little lake, in a punt, in much the same place as before. She evinced the greatest surprise on seeing him. The unrepentant man jumped in, beaming with delight, and plumped himself right down beside her. "Edmund, you mustn't. Have you forgotten what I said? No, I won't let you," said Madeleine, and fell into his arms. And that was all the reference she made to their last encounter. Dr. Bickleigh, though a little bewildered, went on to spend a blissful afternoon. Madeleine had never been more delightful, either as a companion or lover. And they were practical, too. The sanitation at the Hall had astonished Dr. Bickleigh. It could never have been improved much since the primitive days when the house was built. Dr. Bickleigh told her that she must really do something about it. It was a scandal. It was unhealthy. It was positively dangerous. Madeleine quite agreed. Undoubtedly she must do something about it. Dr. Bickleigh sketched out an alarmed picture of Madeleine expiring of typhoid in his arms. He became extremely distressed and earnest. Madeleine must really do something about it at once. Madeleine continued to agree. Undoubtedly, she must do something about it at once. It was delightful to discuss these practical details with her. Even sanitation took on a kind of sanctified aspect when considered in relation to Madeleine. That evening he told Julia. Thinking it out on the way home from the hall, he had made up his mind. He wanted to tell Julia badly, both because he detested the concealment and was still as anxious as ever to keep everything connected with this marvellous love on as high a level of purity and honesty as the love itself, and also, as he did not realize quite so plainly, because, having come, during the last 10 years, to rely entirely upon Julia in every difficulty, he needed her help more than ever in this supreme one. Julia took it incredibly well. "Now, Edmund," she had said, directly the coffee tray had been removed, "at least I am able to speak to you. I understand that, in direct contradiction of my wishes, you have been—" "Wait a minute, Julia," Dr. Bickleigh interrupted. He got up and stood on the hearthrug, his back to the fireplace. He felt quite calm and not even nervous. The exaltation he always experienced when he had been with Madeleine was still with him. "I want to speak to you, too, about Miss Cranmere. I want to tell you this. I love Miss Cranmere, and she loves me." Julia's pale blue eyes, prominent behind their thick lenses, regarded him searchingly. She was silent for several moments, perhaps in astonishment at the first dignified speech she had ever heard from her husband. At last she said, "I was afraid of this." Her tone was as normal as if she had told him to pass the butter. Dr. Bickleigh felt a little jump inside his chest on the left and realized that he had not been quite so calm as he imagined. "I'm sorry, Julia," he said lamely, completely spoiling the effect. "Well, Edmund, it's no good apologizing," returned Julia with brisk sanity. "Perhaps instead you'll tell me what you propose to do about it." But that was just what Edmund did not know. He intimated as much confusedly. Julia was still examining him minutely, as if she had hardly ever seen him before. "And how am I to know," she said slowly, "that this is not just another of the ordinary, sordid intrigues in which you have indulged continuously since we married? No, don't bother to deny it. I've known how you were behaving, Irene Stamford, Sybil Whitechurch, the Ryder girl, Dean Pryor's daughter in Merchester, Ivy Ridgway, even Mabel Christow. I've said nothing, because that sort of vulgarity simply doesn't interest me. But the time has come for plain speaking. How am I to know that this affair with Miss Cranmere is not another of those?" Dr. Bickleigh coloured. To hear Madeleine's name put on a par with Irene's, Ivy's, Mabel's, he began to speak hotly. Julia stopped him. "Very well. I see that you do think yourself really in love with this girl, and presumably you have had opportunities of discovering that she thinks herself in love with you. Whether you both are or not remains to be seen, though the acquaintance is rather short, is it not?" Dr. Bickleigh's mumbled reply seemed to be to the effect that when two people are utterly in tune with each other, it does not take years to recognize the fact. It is plain at first sight. "Love at first sight. I see. Most romantic at your age," nodded Julia, but her tone was less unkind than her words. "Well, Edmund, I ask you again, what do you wish me to do about this love at first sight of yours? It's unfortunate that you have a wife, but there it is. However, if it's any consolation to you, I will put into plain words what you know perfectly well, that I am not in love with you in the least and never have been. I married you to escape from an intolerable situation at home, and you are therefore perfectly right in assuming, as of course you do, that I have no moral claim on you at all, so you can speak quite plainly." "Well, this is awfully decent of you, Julia," exclaimed Dr. Bickleigh, flushing with gratitude and relief. "Really? Oh, Julia, I may have a few decent feelings, though you have seldom credited me with any," returned Julia without emotion. "Well?" "Well, I thought you might divorce me." In spite of her invitation to plain speaking, Dr. Bickleigh felt considerable embarrassment. After all, "Yes, of course. I'm afraid my decency doesn't carry me to the point of letting you divorce me. But you realize that such a thing would ruin your practice here immediately?" "Yes. I thought of starting again somewhere else." "And I'm afraid you would have to make me an allowance. As you know, I have no money of my own at all. How do you propose to do that and work up a new practice at the same time?" "Oh, I don't think there'd be any difficulty about that, Julia." "I see. You propose to pension off your first wife out of your second wife's money?" I haven't thought out any details at all yet," stammered Dr. Bickleigh. Julia smoothed out the black silk on her lap, took off her glasses, polished them on her handkerchief, replaced them, and looked at her husband. "Now listen, Edmund. You can imagine that in the ordinary course I wouldn't listen to this idea of yours for an instant. The reason I do so is because it is Miss Cranmere who is involved. As even you have had the wit to recognize, she is a most exceptional girl. I won't say anything about her taste in selecting you out of all the men who should be glad to marry her, but I will say that you may consider yourself undeservedly fortunate. I cannot say that I know her at all well. Beyond the calls we have exchanged on our tennis party here, we have hardly met. But she made a most favourable impression on me, most favourable. In these circumstances, and in view of those of our own marriage, I am prepared to give you your chance. But I must be certain that she is not mistaken in her feelings for you. Yours for her I will take for granted. I therefore stipulate that all three of us go on as we are for another year, during which you may see as much of each other as you like, and if at the end of it she still wishes to marry you, then you shall have your divorce." Dr. Bickleigh, yammering incoherences, bounded forward and kissed his wife smackingly on the cheek. "Good Lord, Julia, you are... I say, I never dreamt you'd be so... Well, I've always said you were the most sensible woman I knew, but..." Mrs. Bickleigh held up a finger. "But understand this, Edmund. If during that year you attempt to make Miss Cranmere your mistress, even in anticipation of marriage..." Dr. Bickleigh's schoolboy exuberance dropped from him. He drew back in disgust. Then reason reasserted itself. He looked at Julia only pityingly. After all, she could not help her sort of mind. That was on the Monday. All Tuesday, Dr. Bickleigh had to hug his secret to himself. On the Wednesday, just a week after Madeleine had sent him wandering so miserably into Merchester, he set off for the Hall in the highest of possible high spirits. What news to bring her, and what an afternoon ahead of him! He would even stay to dinner if she asked him. He turned in at the drive with assurance and drove up to the house as if he were already its prince consort. Talk about your Mr. Tawes now! It was with quite a shock that Dr. Bickleigh realized that he really was going to be part owner of this delightful place. Madeleine's wealth, after he had overcome his first feeling of insignificance, which the presence of riches always induced in him, had faded quite into the background. Madeleine was Madeleine and nothing else. But he did not feel it sordid to reflect now that it was exceedingly pleasant that Madeleine should be rich Madeleine too. After all, Madeleine's money was only incidental, though delightfully so, when one cannot afford even a new tennis net. "Miss Cranmere?" He smiled so happily at the parlour-maid at the door that in spite of her training she smiled back. "I'm sorry, sir. Miss Cranmere is out." "Out?" He tried to pull himself together. "Didn't she leave a message for me? I had, she made an appointment." The parlour-maid looked most concerned, but no, Miss Cranmere had left no message. "She must have forgotten all about it," muttered the doctor. "Nuisance. Thank you." He went home, took off his best suit, put on his oldest, and gardened furiously till tea-time. Julia looked faintly surprised to see him, but said nothing. She had to go out, Dr. Bickleigh felt himself called upon to mumble. "Couldn't get out of it. Left me a note." Julia continued to say nothing. On Thursday evening, however, she did say something. She said, "I met Lady Bourne this afternoon. She tells me that Miss Cranmere and Denny are entering for the mixed doubles in the Merchester tournament." It was another of the unexpected things about Madeleine that she played a game of tennis, exceptionally good even in these days of feminine proficiency. "They fixed it up yesterday." "Yesterday?" "Yes. Miss Cranmere was playing there yesterday afternoon. Didn't you know, Edmund?" "Oh, yes. Yes, of course. I'd forgotten." It was a poor attempt. Julia said nothing. On Friday afternoon, Madeleine was waiting for him. He had not meant to reproach her, just utter a mild expostulation. But there was no need. Madeleine at once began to reproach herself. "Edmund, will you ever forgive me?" "Forgive you, dear? There's nothing to forgive." He climbed into the punt beside her. But she would not let him kiss her till she had explained properly. "I was terribly disappointed, and I knew you'd think me a beast. I was a beast, a devil." The extent of her self-vituperation seemed extravagant for so minor an offence. "But I simply couldn't help it, dear, honestly. I had to go to the Bournes." Her big eyes searched his in appeal for forgiveness. She looked as solemn as if she were confessing to something really dreadful. "Of course, darling." He wanted to kiss her badly. "It would have looked so funny if I'd refused. They'd have known I wasn't going anywhere else." Madeleine had apparently not finished apologizing yet, although any faint misgivings Dr. Bickleigh might have harboured had long ago disappeared. "I had to go, you see, for both our sakes. Did you hate me very much, Edmund?" "Good gracious, no. I thought it must be something like that." And, as Madeleine was really looking as if she would not be content unless he did reproach her, he added mildly, "Just wondered why you didn't leave a note, perhaps. That's all." "Oh, I couldn't, dear." Madeleine appeared quite shocked. "What would the servants have thought?" "There is no one more sensitive to other people's opinions of him than a doctor. He has to be, for other people's opinions of him are his bread and butter, or the lack of it." But Dr. Bickleigh did feel that this was carrying deference to them a little too far. The next instant he felt guiltily disloyal for having thought so. "Oh, yes, of course. Never thought of that." Then you really do forgive me? Of course I do, though there's nothing to forgive. At last he was allowed to kiss her. Dr. Bickleigh noticed with relief that there was no hint in Madeleine's manner of the mood of a week ago. He thought he understood that now. It was just a first reaction on the part of so pure and high-souled a girl to having let another woman's husband make love to her. Certainly her behaviour was being most satisfactory at the moment. He judged the time propitious to bring out his great news. "Darling, I've got something wonderful to tell you. I told Julia last night about us. I thought you wouldn't mind really, and—" "You told her? About us?" Madeleine's voice was shrill, and her face had gone suddenly quite white. "Yes." Dr. Bickleigh was startled by the abrupt change in her, and tried to hurry on with his explanation. "I hated the idea of anything underhand about us, you see, and I thought it over, and— But I told you not to. You promised not to, you promised." "No, darling, I didn't." Dr. Bickleigh had to remonstrate. "I very carefully—" "You did promise." "No, really, You did! You beast, Edmund! How dare you when I didn't want you to? You promised not to. It's horrible of you." Dr. Bickleigh had attributed Madeleine's change of colour to concern on behalf of Julia. He now saw that it was due to sheer rage. Madeleine began, there is really no other word for it, to storm at him. During the next few moments it transpired, and with force, that Madeleine was seriously annoyed. The unfortunate Dr. Bickleigh learnt a number of things about himself which he had always suspected to be true, but had hoped Madeleine didn't. Obviously, he had done something not merely foolish, but incredibly mean and underhand, because Madeleine told him so not once, but several times. His humble protestations that he had only been trying to do the right thing because he detested any hole-and-corner business in connection with her carried no weight at all. He was, instead, a cad, a blunderer, and the villain of the piece. Of all this, Madeleine, in her new role of truth stepping out of the well, informed him with surprising emphasis. Dr. Bickleigh knew that Madeleine could not be wrong, and he must therefore be all these things. But he did wish he knew how he had proved it merely by trying for once to be honest. That Julia had not minded at all, Madeleine brushed aside as beneath notice. Apparently she ought to have minded, and so it had been a piece of outrageous cruelty to tell her. Altogether, Dr. Bickleigh left her that afternoon, or rather was left, for it was certainly Madeleine who did the leaving, in a state of considerable bewilderment. If variety is the spice of love, Dr. Bickleigh might have reflected that he was certainly getting his own well seasoned. The next day he did not see her, nor the next. Julia preserved a tactful silence in face of his evident moodiness. On the Monday, Madeleine was not on the lake, nor could he find her in the wood. In desperation he went up to the house, regardless of the parlourmaid's possible condemnation. The parlourmaid, so far from displaying any signs of disapproval, welcomed him like an old and valued friend. Miss Cranmere, she informed him, was in the drawing-room. Would he come in? He would, and did. Madeleine received him sorrowfully, as one uncertain whether to take the lost sheep back into the fold or not. The sheep apologized with humility for his lapse. That he was apologizing really for having been honest occurred apparently to neither of them, and went on apologizing, so long and so humbly that in the end Madeleine forgave him for what he had not done, and opened the door of the fold once more. "But, Edmund," she told him very gravely before letting him quite in, "if you ever break another promise to me, if you make me feel I can't really trust you—" Dr. Bickleigh forbore to point out that he had not broken a promise at all yet, for by this time he had quite accepted the accusation and believed in it as firmly as she did. The way thus cleared, they were able to discuss Julia's remarkable offer. Madeleine agreed that it was noble, generous, more than they could ever have expected, anything he liked. But, though showing moderate pleasure, she certainly did not share the doctor's immoderate enthusiasm. He could not understand why. Here was the path being cleared for their feet, and Madeleine could only smile sadly and say how nice it was, and how kind of Julia. He pressed her, but could get no satisfactory answer. At last she told him, "Oh, Edmund, I never thought I should have to marry a divorced man." This point of view astonished Dr. Bickleigh. Why did she mind that? For religious reasons? Oh, no. It was not a matter of religion. Madeleine hoped she was not so narrow-minded as all that. Why, then? You know people talk so. It's horrid. But, my darling, surely you don't mind what silly people say, so long as we're happy. No, dear, of course I don't. But it's not very nice, is it? Dr. Bickleigh did not point out that she had already set the wyvern's cross tongues wagging by coming to live at the Hall alone, because if her charming innocence on that head were dispelled, she would probably import an aunt or something equally in the way. Instead, he tried to soothe her with comforting facts. Well, I should have to give up this practice, of course. We can settle down somewhere else where no one will know. Or go abroad, darling. Or anything, so long as we're together and you're happy. In that case, Madeleine agreed, things might not be so bad. But she remained disappointingly unenthusiastic. Not that she seemed to love him any the less. Once he had been taken back into the fold, the shepherdess withheld none of its privileges. But it was disconcerting that she should interrupt some of their most intimate moments with a wailing cry, "Oh, Edmund, if only you weren't married! You don't know how I hate the idea of divorce." Dr. Bickleigh did know. Madeleine seemed to take pains that he should. However, she asked him to stay to dinner, and on the whole he spent a very wonderful and holy day. There was only one other small thing which disconcerted him. Julia had remarked the other evening that a little later on, when things were less tempestuous, she would call on Madeleine and discuss the situation sensibly. When Dr. Bickleigh casually mentioned this after dinner, Madeleine was vehement in her opposition. Such a thing was sordid. It was embarrassing. It was altogether impossible. Dr. Bickleigh, who had thought it most sporting of Julia, and entirely in keeping with the way in which he wished the whole situation to be handled, was surprised, but knew now better than to argue. He hurriedly changed the subject. But he was perturbed. If Julia had said she was going to call, she would call, and if Madeleine, as she protested she would, refuse to see her when she did call, what was going to happen? He left the question to look after itself. Driving home late that night, he was able to see the interview in perspective. Instantly it became plain that Madeleine's dislike of marrying a divorced man was not captious at all, but simply entrancing. Naturally, to her flower-like mind, the idea had been an obnoxious shock. But she would get used to it. She must. Julia did call on Madeleine. She called about a fortnight later. During that time, the course of true love had been running more smoothly. Things seemed to have settled down. Madeleine was particularly charming and affectionate, and Dr. Bickleigh had been living in high heaven. The Merchester tournament came and went, and for 4 days Dr. Bickleigh did not see her at all, for he was too busy to get over there. She and Denny Bourne reached the semi-finals, when they were beaten by a Davis Cup player and his partner, but even then not disastrously. Madeleine could hardly talk about anything else when she saw him next. Dr. Bickleigh, who had no idea that she attached so much importance to games, was charmed by yet another side of this many-faceted young woman. He entered light-heartedly into her mood, and they spent one of the happiest afternoons they had had together. Julia's call shattered heaven in ugly fragments. She did not give the least hint that she had been until the evening. Then, as they were sitting in the drawing-room, she looked up from her crochet work and said abruptly, "Edmund, I called on Miss Cranmere this afternoon." "Oh, yes?" said the doctor apprehensively. Julia's tone was ominous. "I rang her up in the morning to make the appointment. She was out, so I left the message. When I got there, the maid said she was ill in bed and could not see me." Julia paused. "Ill?" echoed Dr. Bickleigh, alarmed. "As ill as you or I. However, I insisted, and she saw me." From Julia's voice, it was possible to gather that she was cutting quite a long story short here. "She received me in a white cotton nightgown," she continued surprisingly, "and a red flannel dressing-gown." She paused again significantly. "Oh, yes," said Dr. Bickleigh vaguely, not seeing the significance. Cotton was perhaps not the material he himself would have chosen for a nightgown, but it was only another example of the charming unsophistication of Madeleine's tastes. "Did she?" he added, as Julia still seemed to be waiting for something. "Well, does that convey nothing to you?" Dr. Bickleigh, who was not disposed to share his opinion of Madeleine's simple unfleshliness, shook his head. "Why, does a girl who could afford to have her nightgowns of triple ninon and gold lame dressing-gowns wear cotton and red flannel?" demanded Julia sternly. "I'll tell you, Edmund, because she wants even the housemaid to think her that sort of gal." "What?" asked the bewildered doctor. Julia took off her glasses, polished and replaced them, an invariable portent of serious speech. "Edmund, I am not one to mince my words. What I have to say will pain you, and I am sorry for that, but it has got to be said. My interview with Miss Cranmere this afternoon was most instructive. I don't propose to tell you even the gist of it, certainly not the foolish things that were said, only what it has opened my eyes to. Edmund, I am sorry to have to say so, but that girl is a hypocrite." "Julia!" exclaimed Dr. Bickleigh, colouring angrily. "A hypocrite," repeated Mrs. Bickleigh calmly. "She hasn't the least feeling for you. She is merely amusing herself. She has not the faintest intention of marrying you, even if you are ever free. Did you even know that she is conducting a flirtation with Denny Bourne every bit as violent as the one with you? She is a poseuse of the very worst description. She is acting the whole time. If she had her living to make, she would be on the stage at once. She is obviously hysterical, and yet at the same time I could detect in her a callous calculation which quite disgusted me. Her selfishness is inconceivable. Nothing interests her but herself and her own silly emotions. In short, I should call her utterly untrustworthy, egotistical to the point of mania, and the most dangerous kind of liar there is, the liar who can deceive not only other people, but herself as well. Naturally, added Julia, as if anxious to be fair, I did not discover this all at once. It only dawned on me gradually, and at first I could not believe it.
and then I began to test her, and discovered that she was worse than I suspected. It was not a pleasant process, but necessary for both our sakes. I may say that of course Miss Cranmere has no idea of my opinion of her.